It was primarily the industry. So it was acquisitions people, festival and television programmers, I guess newspaper editors, arts editors at consumer papers who would be looking to see which of the big films we're going to profile when they get into the commercial mix, because we were viewing them at the festival stage or often just a month or two in advance of their release. So that was always specifically at the industry.
Is there ever any discussion with the people that you're writing for about what they would like you to do?
At Variety, the mandate was pretty clear. It was always, you give a sense of its commercial expectations. There was a sense of describing the film to a certain degree, how it looks physically, how people are likely to respond to it emotionally. And people get kind of pissed, of those of us who've been through that mill of trade journalism, people get pissed that we give away too much plot. And no one wants to give away spoilers, but there's a certain amount of plot required in a basic trade review.
There are certain releases that everybody wants to know about, everybody's talking about, and you want to be part of that conversation. You want to convey to your readers that you know that this is the thing that everybody's interested in right now, and that you're on it, and that you've got something to say about it, and hopefully that something is insightful. I mean, what I haven't touched on there is that I hope that our critics elucidate and inform and entertain as well. I mean, they're not the add-ons, they're the value. That's where the real value lies. But all those other things I've talked about are the kind of the nuts and bolts that have to be addressed, I think.
What about beyond that? I mean, beyond the function of being a consumer guide, is there any other function that a critic can serve? And we don't have to hold it to mainstream critics. We can talk, there are a whole range of other contexts in which people write. Fred, what do you think? I mean, in terms of, would you like to see critics doing something more than that?
Look, it's very difficult because it's quite personal for most people, and perhaps I would like to see critics work outside their own taste or have an understanding of things that are outside their taste that they may not particularly like, but could understand that a certain section of the audience or a lot of other people might really like, and be looking for that as much as at the same time expressing their personal opinion. There are people at the Village Voice, Andrew Saris, for instance, who has never liked anything I've done and just slams it, But I don't mind, because it's definitely a very clear attitude to filmmaking and his personal beliefs. What I would like is if he could actually see that maybe there were other values there. I had a very strange thing on the recent film, that I had critics in America absolutely raving about it, and I had just as many critics absolutely hating it, but for exactly the same reasons. But it just about sends you nuts. That's why you don't read them. And then critics were coming out writing criticisms of the critics for not liking it. It's like, didn't help the audience too much.
I think even the vitriolic people, everybody generalizes and says critics are about takedown and destruction. I think critics are as much about discovery. And, we all enjoy pouring shit on a really toxic vanity piece that has no merit, where the hubris outweighs the talent or the inspiration. That's what bugs me. But it's much more rewarding to find a little nugget, especially if you're in a giant fish tank like Toronto where there are 300 films, and you really have to work hard to sort the gems from the crap. But you find that gem, and it may be some unsung film with a director you've never heard of and with a bunch of actors you've never heard of, and there's a real joy in discovering that and bringing it to other people's attention.
You see, I think audiences have a right to be warned about the content of films that they might find offensive. I think that's all people need. I think they need that information. I think we're part of that information. David thinks that it's our obligation to tell people about a handheld camera because people get... He assures me that people are getting seasick. You know what he's like. And I'm happy to do that. I don't want people to be made ill through a film experience.
It's a moral issue, really.
And I think that's also part of our role, to say it is pretty confronting, and it is actually so confronting. I actually didn't want to have that experience at all, which I think we're going to talk about in a minute.
Well, if you want to raise it...
you were going to raise it. I'm not going to do it.
Can I just hop in for a sec, Tom? Because, I do feel like my emphasis there on the consumer function has been reduced to that's all it should be about. And that's certainly not what I'm suggesting for a moment. I absolutely think that it's the role of the critic to connect what's going on in a film to what's going on in the outside world, to draw those dots and to open up pathways of understanding, to elucidate and illuminate. That's what good criticism does. And I don't know that it needs to be like, oh my God, I'm morally outraged, but somehow connecting.
I'm never morally outraged.
No, I'm not saying you. But say the Braillard thing. If it is that there's a story about a woman who wants to be raped, then why? Why? That's the question that I think a critic has to grapple with. Not is this good or bad, but why? Why is this pertinent now? Why is this happening? Why is this a subject of interest to a filmmaker, and why is this question on the agenda all of a sudden?
Look, I sat through Wolf Creek 2 in the Roadshow theatre. Thank you, Joel. And if I had known that we were not going to review it, I would have walked out, because I absolutely loathed it. I thought it hit a really a nadir of Australian cinema.
Why are you looking at me when you say that?
Because it's your fault.
It was your cinema. And I came out of it, enraged, as I can be. And I walked back into the office and I went, I can't wait to tell everybody what a lousy piece of shit I think this film is. And it was the first show back. I think it got released on February 20th, and we went back on air on the 18th. And I've checked. And if David had really, really loved it, we would have run with it. But he was very lukewarm about it. And we instead, and I've looked up the films we covered on that show, and it was catching up with all the films of recent weeks, like The Wolf of Wall Street, The Past, and then we reviewed Le Weekend, Nebraska, Blue is the Warmest Colour. So it was, these were just, the show was chock-a-block with films that you could enthuse about. And the mistake, I think, that was made was me being narky and provocative and saying at the end of the show, we have chosen not to review Wolf Creek 2. I should have just shut my big mouth and let it go.
What I will say is that I think the reason it became such a touchstone when that happened was because we're talking about Australian filmmakers. And even though I'm sure, Australian filmmakers run the gamut of those who are obsessively waiting to read reviews and those who might not want to read their reviews, when you end up in a situation where it's an Australian film that is going out, Australia is the first market to release the film, so the volume of Australian reviews are really the critical mass at that point in time. It is very noticeable.
You had them from everybody else.
Yeah, but we didn't have it from you, and the reality is there's not a lot of television reviews. There's not a lot. And people pay a lot of attention to what you and David say. That is a reality in this market. You are incredibly respected. You're frankly, you're quite beloved. And so when a filmmaker, and in this case, when the filmmakers on Wolf Creek 2 discovered that they weren't being reviewed, they were really upset about it. And because they weren't remotely of the view that you would necessarily like the film, but they felt their work warranted a review. And I think that was where it became, frankly, fascinating to watch, because it got really emotional for a lot of people.
Well, I mean, Greg McLean was, one of the first to respond.
You reviewed the first one and you both gave it 4 stars. So,
yeah. But I actually
ipso facto, the sequel to it is significant. It was the most successful horror film ever made in this country. It is a sequel
actually
to it.
tapped into the zeitgeist of the time.
Sure.
With the Ivan Milat stuff and the Falcone on
No
the
question.
videos. So, in fact, there was a cultural touchstone that validated the first one in all its nastiness. You were there. I don't know whether you were there in Cannes, but you could hear the seats slapping up as people walked out at that certain point in the original Wolf Creek. And I think it was a very well-made film. I mean, really, it burst onto the screen and was pretty effectively terrifying. I don't think that justification was there for the second one.
Which would have been great to hear you say on telly.
Well, I'm saying it now.
At which point the police are beginning to gather at the back, I see, in order to remove us from the stage. So what I'd love would be that system where you can kind of fade a song out at the end, that the conversation was continuing, as it will.
Just keep talking amongst you, I'll do it on the
Okay,
soundtrack.
so... But beforehand, what I'd really like to do is thank our guests who've been wonderful.